You must sort out your mute your mute what to call instrument. Minister Pasha, good afternoon all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to have a conversation with you about the details of what the President announced last night. Just as few remarks, yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, marked 750 days since the country was placed in a national state of disaster as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. On the 15th March 2020, the President addressed the nation, and let me quote some of what he said. Open quote, "The world is facing a medical emergency far graver than what we have experienced in over a century. The World Health Organization has declared the coronavirus outbreak as a global pandemic," close quote. He further continued, open quote, "Never before in the history of our democracy has our country been confronted with such a severe situation," close quote. He concluded his address that evening by saying the following, open quote, "But it is up to us to determine how long it will last, how damaging it will be, and how long it will take our economy and our country to recover." Again, close quote. His closing appeal to the country was the following words. Open quote, "But if we act together, if we act now, and if we act decisively, we will recover, we will overcome it," close quote. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday evening, the President addressed the nation and indicated that, if I am to paraphrase, there is no doubt that the action or response we took then as government was necessary step, and under these prevailing circumstances, the measure that we put, as indicated by the President, were effective in slowing down the rate of infection, easing pressure on our hospitals, and most importantly, providing the time needed and necessary to ready ourselves and the country. We were able to develop the necessary infrastructure, pool resources, and coordinate our capacity to manage the large number of people who became ill. It is against this background that the President last night, ladies and gentlemen, announced the ending of the national state of disaster. We are now increasing speed in our efforts to revive our economy, which has been negatively impacted by the pandemic. Today, the Minister of Health, Dr. Pasha, and Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, will further unpack the way forward as we manage the COVID without the national state of disaster for the first time. Now, at this point in time, I will invite Dr. Dlamini Zuma, who is joining us virtually from the Free State. She will be followed by Dr. Pasha. Minister Nkosazana, if you can take the platform. Okay. Thank you. Over to you, Minister.
Is that me, Minister Kumubela? I lost you.
Thank you. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to the ministers, to GCIS, and to all the members of the media. As Minister Kumubela has introduced the matter, what has happened is that the President last night announced the termination of the national state of disaster, and that was done last night. That does not mean the end of the pandemic. The pandemic is still there. What it means is that it is at such a level that it can be managed without using the Disaster Management Act. It no longer qualifies as a disaster, but it's still there. So it means that it has to be managed by normal legislation, not the Disaster Management Act, because the Disaster Management Act cannot be used permanently. It's a temporary, it's of temporary use. So we have exited now the national state of disaster. But obviously, since the pandemic is still there, we needed to introduce transitional measures which are allowed by the Disaster Management Act, which are post-disaster measures. So what those post-disaster management and rehabilitation measures are is that we should still continue wearing masks for at least another 30 days indoors, in gatherings indoors. Outdoors, it's not necessary, but in gatherings indoors, we still need to do that. But we still, and health will also expand on why we did that. We also still need to limit the number of people in gatherings. So we'll continue with the 1,000 indoors and 2,000 outdoors at 1 meter apart. And of course, indoors they will wear masks, but there are no other requirements. You don't have to produce the vaccine or the test. There's a vaccine certificate on the test, but if you want to go beyond 1,000 indoors, you can go up to 50% of the venue. But if it's more than 1,000, then you have to have a gathering of people who are either vaccinated and they can show a vaccine certificate, or can show a test that's not more than 72 hours old. And that is for 1 month, 30 days. And of course, the borders that are open will continue being open, but people coming in from will have to either show a vaccine certificate or a PCR test that is not more than 72 hours. Then there are other transitional arrangements. You will recall that because of the unemployment that has been exacerbated by the COVID, there was a grant of 350 that's being paid. So that grant will continue. So we're just transitioning that through these transitional arrangements for 30 days, but beyond that, it will continue through other legislation. And of course, there's been a big backlog of renewal of driver's licenses and applying for new ones. And that will also continue for that period. And then hopefully by then, the normal procedures will be followed. And then the third and last one is the no-fault compensation for those people who may have adverse effects or be sick or something from the vaccine, so that you can apply for the compensation, and that process will continue, but that one will continue beyond the national state of disaster, because as long as people are being vaccinated, they should be able to have that access to the NOF compensation, NOF compensation. So, but from the Disaster Management Act, these will only continue for the next 30 days. After that, they will lapse. And we will then go back to normal, except that legislation from the different sectors will then take on when necessary. But it also means that if the pandemic were to escalate and reach a level where it becomes a disaster, the Disaster Management Act can still be utilized. So if we look after ourselves, wear masks, and make sure that we do what needs to be done, wash our hands and all that, we may avoid a situation where this pandemic becomes a disaster again, and that's what we're hoping for. But in the event it becomes a disaster, we will have to bring back the Management Act. That's what really I wanted to say. Ngithi-ke izolo umongameli wesiqedile lento yokuthi sisesimweni senhlekelele le-COVID. Akusho ukuthi ayisekho i-COVID, isekho. Kodwa ayisekho ezingeni esingase silibize ngenhlekelele size sisebenzise lo mthetho osetshenziswayo uma kukhona into evelile eyinhlekelele ezweni. Kodwa-ke ukuze sikwazi ukuthi siphume kahle, kukhona imithetho ezoqhubeka nje inyanga eyodwa. Njengokuthi izifonyo zisazogqokwa mawuse enhlanganisweni, emhlanganweni ongaphakathi. Mawusemhlanganweni ongaphandle, asadingeki isifonyo ngaphandle mawuzithandela nje. Nokuthi imihlangano inombolo, izibalo zabantu abasemhlanganweni zisazoba nesibalo esithize. Sisazoqhubeka nenkulungwane ngaphakathi nenkulungwane 2 ngaphandle njengoba bekwenzeka. Kodwa uma ufuna ukuba nenombolo ezingaphezulu noma nezibalo ezingaphezulu kwenkulungwane ngaphakathi nenkulungwane 2 ngaphandle, ungagcwalisa leyo ndawo ehlangene kuyona. Mayinkulu kakhulu ikwazi ukuthatha izibalo ezingaphezulu kwenkulungwane ngaphakathi, ungakwazi ukuyigcwalisa ize ifike ku-half. Uma isifike ku-half, kodwa fanele abantu abalapho bakwazi ukufeza isitifiketi sokugomela i-COVID, bakwazi ukuveza impumela ye-test yokuthi awunayo i-COVID esingesidala ngaphezu kwamahora 72. La kungenwa khona emabhoda, kufanele ukuthi mawufika uveze isitifiketi sokuthi ugomile, noma uveze imiphumela yokuthi ucwaningile ukuthi awunayo i-COVID esingesidala ngaphezu kwamahora 72. Bese kuthi njengoba kade kukholwa le mali abantu abangasebenzi u-350 rand izoqhubeka nayo izikwazi ukungena emthethweni normal, kodwa izoqhubeka izumiswa ukuthi lo mthetho osetshenziswa uma kunenhlekelele asezusebenziswa kwamanje ney'ncwadi zokushayela, driver's license, zizoqhubeka zi-aplayele ngoba nabantu abaningi abangakwazanga ukuzi-aplayela noma ukuzivuselela njengoba kade kune-COVID nje, nazo zoqhubeka inyanga, kodwa emva kwaloko sezobe seyiqhubeka ngomthetho ojwayelekile. Nalento okuthiwa isinxephezelo uma ngabe kwenzekile ukuthi mhlambe yakugulisa umjovo we-COVID, izoqhubeka yona ngoba solonga abantu besajova nge-COVID kufanele ukuthi bakwazi ukusizakala, makufanele basizakale uma kukhona okungahambanga kahle. Kodwa-ke njengoba kade ngigcizelela ukuthi isekhona i-COVID, ngakho-ke uma singagcina le mthetho kungasiza ukuthi i-COVID ihlale ingekho esimweni esesingabizwa njengenhlekelele. Kodwa uma kungenzeka ukuthi gcine inombolo seyikhuphuka, nabantu abashonayo bekhuphuka, nabantu abadinga amagumbi, abantu abasecayini ey'bhedlela bebe baningi, iyophinde ibuye. Akusho ukuthi seyiphuma unomphelo, iphuma unomphelo solong kungekho iy'namba ezenza ukuthi sesingayibiza ngenhlekelele. So kukuthina-ke njengoba nomongameli kade ukuthi uma siyiphathe kahle, saqhubeka ngento kufanele sizenze, saziphatha kahle, sajova, senza konke, kungenzeka ukuthi ingaphindi ibe inhlekelele. Yilokho-ke ebesifisa ukusho. Ngiyabonga.
Thank you very much, Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. That was eloquent in both languages. We couldn't have asked for more. You will await fielding questions, Mama. Thank you very much. Dr. Patla?
Thank you very much, Minister Gungubele, and greetings to Minister Dlamini Zuma on virtual, and greetings to colleagues from the media present here, and also those who are participating on other platforms. From the health side, very pleased to speak to you this afternoon as a follow-up to the announcement by His Excellency President Ramaphosa last night about the fact that we now reach the stage where we can exit from utilization of the Disaster Management Act as a tool to manage this pandemic. I must say on the outset that we really thank the Minister of COCTA, Minister Dlamini Zuma, who has led us from the front under command of the President through Command Council, because this act falls under authority. I know that in the process she's taken a lot of pressure, a lot of flack from the many legal actions against decisions which have been taken, but she's been there steadfast, guiding us in this respect. Now, this was a very important tool for us over the last 2 years. I still remember that when the World Health Organization declared this as a public health emergency of international concern, and also as a pandemic, we grappled with what measures are available to effect the kind of controls which were required. And after a lot of debate, it was a lot of looking at legal advices as to what could be done. We then settled on the Disaster Management Act. and that it was an act which was available, which is flexible through regulations, through directions, and this has really worked very well over the last 2 years. Now, so we are where we are, as the President announced, because of the fact that the situation is fairly stable. We know that we have had 4 waves of this COVID. We just exited the 4th wave just over a month ago. We still monitor on a daily basis through the National Institute of Communicable Diseases, and we can say to you that, as the numbers are always announced in the public media, that when we say that this pandemic is not over, we are not exaggerating. We can see that on a daily basis we are stable at the low base, but as we speak now, we say we are stable because in terms of daily infections, depending on what day of the week, how many people presented for testing on the weekends, sometime just like the numbers which were announced yesterday, being on a Monday, being the tests which were done on Sunday, you will find that below 1,000. We're just above, just below 700 yesterday. So currently the infection numbers fluctuate between 600 and on some days over 1,500 and slightly above. In terms of positivity rate, it's been fluctuating between 5%, like yesterday, just around 5%, and on some days when the numbers are higher, you find some days up to 7%, maximum 8%. And when you look at the other side, which has been characteristic of the 4th wave with the Omicron variant, there has been stability in terms of the severity of the illness, even when the numbers have been high. And where we sit now, on average, we have a number of people admitted in hospital due to COVID just below 2,000. It's been consistent, I think, over the last 2 to 3 weeks. We went below, we're just above 2,000 for quite some time, but now we've even gone below 2,000 of admissions in hospital. And when we look at those in ICU, at current moment, we were for a long time between 200 and 300, but currently, which is a very small number also, currently we're sitting at just below 200 for those who are admitted in intensive care units. So, but because of this understanding that the pandemic is not over, we were advised that in terms of a classification, as the Minister has said, it no more falls within what can be defined as a national disaster, but the pandemic is still there. It remains a threat. Anytime if we drop all our guards, there is a real threat that it can, rise up again. And we have seen it because we are not an island. We not only watch what's happening in our country, but we watch also what's happening in other countries. And we can see that when countries just drop everything, the rate of infections rises. And when even if we say, with the current variant with less severity, with proportionally lesser people falling seriously ill, but any serious illness is a major concern, and any loss of life should be a major concern. So even if we say that compared to what used to happen, if the previous rates was maybe 10% of all those who are testing positive getting seriously ill, and now we're looking at say 5% or lower, there are still many people who are still ill in hospital. There are still people who are losing their lives as a result of this virus. So and the fact of the matter is that we know that if we drop everything, there will be a serious threat. And that is why, as per the Act, as the President announced and as the Minister was saying, we have now gone to the conclusion where utilizing an aspect of the Act to say that as we exit, we must use what is called post-disaster management, so that we can contain and avoid, because the Act does make provision to can avoid a flare-up of the same disaster. And of course, as we know, going forward, what is now firmly on the ground, as we published from the Health Department, amendments of health regulations in terms of management of notifiable medical conditions. And I want to emphasize the fact that this is amendments. It is not new regulations, it's amending the regulations for control of notifiable medical conditions have been there. All that we have done now and have published is amendments. So some people are making the mistake as if, health now wants to take over from disaster management. They must come to parliament, they must do this and that. This is existing laws and existing provision under the National Health Act. We all remember that COVID is not the first major notifiable disease. A few years ago, we had listeriosis, which was also ravaging various parts of our country. We've had also Ebola, not huge, but Ebola has also been a scare in the country. There are many other hemorrhagic fevers, Congo fever, as an example, which is very close to the Ebola hemorrhagic fever. So the provisions in the health in the health laws are there under the National Health Act, together with regulations. All that we have published now is the amendment to some of those regulations to try and also make sure that they are positioned properly in terms of taking us forward beyond the exit out of the National Disaster Act. So those published regulations, again, just to emphasize that because the law requires that there must be public comments. So those draft amendment regulations have been published on the 15th of March, closing on the 15th of April for public comments. Those comments will be taken into consideration so that then the final regulations, which will help us going forward, also considering at what level as we monitor the development of the pandemic. So there will be a period after the 15th of April when we started already in terms of as we receive the comments, processing them, and then after the closing date, further processing, and then after that we'll be able to can then announce that beyond the processing now, these are the final regulations. But essentially, unless something drastic happens, we're really advising that as we also listen to our medical scientists, including world bodies like the World Health Organization, that prevention measures such as the use of masks when you are indoor is still very important, because the virus is still there. We have seen what has been happening. We are studying that in some countries as we speak now. There's a lot of concern because some of the countries, as many people who follow the news will know that a big city like Shanghai in China, as we speak, currently is under lockdown. A city of more than 20 million people, and other areas in China and other parts of the world. So these kind of measures are to help us not to go there. The use of face masks indoors, the management of gatherings. Gatherings have, with this kind of airborne diseases, droplet infection, respiratory diseases, anytime when people are gathered in big numbers in close proximity is always a risk. So that's why at this stage, as we want to monitor the situation and see how we go, the issue of gatherings, as already mentioned by Minister Dlamini Zuma, is part of what we're sustaining in terms of the post-disaster recovery regulations, and also provision made also in the health regulations. The issue of ports of entry, as mutations are happening, we have never agreed, for instance, when the Omicron was discovered, when we were closed out of the world, when there were travel bans imposed on our country. And we said, no, we now have been with this disease for quite some time. We have developed means of managing to see what is happening, including safe traveling. And that's why in terms of traveling, we're saying, let there be traveling. We support that. There should not be closure of traveling, but we're taking safety measures. And therefore, the issue of vaccination becomes one of the interventions to look at that, to see whether people are vaccinated. Because if you're vaccinated, you have less risk of, even if you do get the disease, of transmitting to others. And also, if not, then you must have a recent test of COVID, of the PCR of less than 72 hours. So the rest, Minister Dlamini Zuma has dealt with that. So that's really where we are. So we really invite people to make comments, because after that, then the Health Act with its regulations will take over in terms of managing, monitoring, and then making adjustments accordingly in terms of wherever we are. Now, of course, the most important thing, fellow South Africans, remains the fact that if we get more people to be vaccinated, we have always mentioned that we are committed to protect ourselves, to protect our citizens, and we made sure that we have the capacity to provide this safety measure, which is the vaccination. We're still very ready. We still have capacity to do that. We encourage people to come forward, because if we can reach the 70% of adult people vaccinated, even this kind of preventative measures, which we are still, pronouncing now, will be unnecessary, because once we reach a full cover, 70% coverage, then there will be a good enough protection that even these measures will not be required. I know that other scientists have been saying the natural immunity, it's very clear that natural immunity does help. It has helped to reduce our severity. But what is also undisputed is that natural immunity doesn't last for a long time. Those antibodies and other immunity cells do dissipate over time. And that's why even with vaccination, because the level of protection declines over time, we have boosters, and you are able to also strengthen your immunity. But with natural immunity, unless you get a second infection, then there is no further addition to your immune cells. So that's why we say, even if you have had COVID, even if you do have some protection through natural, it's not going to be lasting for long. Take your vaccination, because it will then boost your immunity, and you'll be able to be protected, and at some stage you might need more so that you can be protected. So also, lastly, I want to also just say that public hygiene measures, there are measures which we are no more talking about in this, like it's not included in the post disaster recovery, like hand washing and sanitizing, mainly washing your hands. Sanitizer is useful when there is no water, but otherwise the most important hygiene measure, which protects not only against COVID, about whether we're talking about cholera, whether we talk about typhoid, we talk about various, hepatitis, many other infectious diseases. Just washing the hands regularly is going to help us. Ventilation, if you have well-ventilated rooms, and making sure that, wherever you are, there's good ventilation, especially when you have a gathering. So I want to end by saying that I've had some commentators, especially some of our colleagues in Parliament from some parties, alleging that all that this government wants to do is to control the people's lives. And that this health now, it means that from disaster now, health is going to be the one regulating people's lives, where they go and so on. Nothing can be closer to the truth. That's very far from the truth, let me say. All that we need is to provide a kind of public health measures which will make us safe, carry on with our social life, carry on with our political, our economic life safely. And all of us, we will be very happy if a few months down the line, if we can reach a stage where we are well protected, even if there's a variant, we know we have some countries, as we meet, we find that they have reached 90% of vaccination. So they can relax everything when they are at 90%. So we hope we will also reach there, and hopefully by somewhere towards the end of this year, this COVID will be completely gone. But for now, it's still there, and we still need to be protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Patla, for that elaborate overview. Thanks to Ms. Dr. Nkosazana, 2 years of resilience in the forefront, on the shoulders of decades of years in pursuit of struggle for human rights. You seem to be having a holding character, strength, and conviction. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, the President said, only if we act together for this to be up to us to determine how long it lasts and how damaging it will. Now is the time for you to engage. Yes, that's a hand there, another. Well, hold Vianney. Another hand. Going. They were very eloquent, eh? Vianney, come in.
Linda Mnisi from Newsroom.
Oh, no, it's Linda. Ah! I thought it was very green. You must check, you look alike. Yourself and Vianney Green. Sorry, Linda.
No problem.
Okay.
Linda Mnisi from Newsroom Africa. My question is around whether government thinks it's moving at the right pace, considering the fact that the fifth wave is predicted to start at the end of April. And if you look at these public comments and the rest of the interventions that will be in place for the next 30 days, are you moving at the right pace? Are you going to be having enough measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 come the fifth wave? And also looking at the issue around the emergence of another variant in the UK. Will you be able to manage all of those things?
Thank you. Any question from online?
Thank you, Minister. We have a set of questions from media houses. I'll start with 3 questions from Alex Mitchley, News 24.
From News 24?
Yes. Minister, which provision in the Act is relied on to have regulations exist despite the termination of the state of disaster? If it's Section 27.2M, isn't that reliant on the state of disaster being in place in terms of Section 27.1? The second question, Minister, nowhere in the Gazette does it speak of the mask mandate being enforced by law enforcement and can constitute a criminal offense. The same can be said about the limitations on gatherings. Can these regulations be enforced, and if so, how? The last question from Alex Mitchley, is the minister, in terms of the state of the Disaster Management Act, empowered to make regulations that exist beyond the state of disaster using the Act? The second set of questions, they are from Tamakan from Business Day. A number of critics, from scientists to lobby groups, have publicly raised concerns about the draft health regulations released for comment last month. They say the proposals overreach the powers in the Health Act and lack sufficient accountability, and that they contain outdated measures aimed at containing a disease that is now widespread. To what extent are you considering the proposals you flighted? The second question, the government began efforts to procure COVID-19 vaccines in late 2020, at a time when expected vaccination would stop infection and potentially eliminate the virus. Why didn't you start planning for exiting the state of disaster back then and give yourself an ample time to craft the necessary rules, regulations? The last question from Business Day. Vaccines, can you provide an update on the Pfizer stocks that expired in June and July? Have you made any progress in finding another government or agency that will either buy them, accept them as a donation, or do a future swap? Okay. And the next set of, can I continue, Minister?
Yes.
Okay. The next question is from Sipoga Zivuso from the Cape Times newspaper. What happens if the current regulations are not adhered to? For example,
maybe these questions are many. Can we deal with News 24? Is that okay? And the business day and stop there and come back to others.
Okay, Minister.
Yes. We will start maybe with Minister Nkosazana, because it's a lot about laws, which provision is relied upon. Are there existing laws to enforce the regulations? Is the minister empowered? There's also a point of outdated measures. Why didn't we prepare on time for this situation? And then you will come, Dr. Patla. Dr. Nkosazana, Minister Nkosazana. Can you call upon Minister Nkosazana to take the questions? Are we connected to her? So in the meantime, Dr. Patla, can we find out, can we check on her connection? She's there. What? There is she?
Let me just say that, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are, ma'am.
No.
You are.
Use yours.
You are audible.
This one is just YouTube. It's just engaging so just connect first, connect. No, it's not just that.
You are audible.
No, I can't hear.
Okay. Okay, let me say that thanks to the questions from the media. If you look at the definition of disaster from the Disaster Management Act itself, the disaster is defined very clearly in the following. That it is sorry, let me just get the act itself. It says that the disaster means a progressive or sudden, widespread or localized natural or human-caused occurrence which causes or threatens to cause death, injury or disease, damage to property, infrastructure or the environment, or disruption of the life of community, and is of a magnitude that exceeds the ability of those affected by the disease to cope with its effects using only their own resources. So the disaster, the pandemic at the beginning up to now was difficult. People couldn't cope just using their own. But now we are saying departments can cope using their own legislation. But it goes on to say that how do you manage the disaster? And it says disaster management means a continuous or integrated multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary process of planning and implementation of measures aimed at preventing or reducing the risk of a disaster, mitigating the severity or consequences of the disasters, emergency preparedness, a rapid and effective response to disasters, and post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. So, in the very definition of the disaster and disaster management, it does say that you must also look at post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. And in the body of the Act, under Section 27M, it also emphasizes the post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. So it means that even when you are no longer in the national state of disaster, or when the disaster itself has passed, you can still do certain measures and you can still respond in a certain way as a way of recovery or rehabilitation. So that's the act we're using, and that act allows us what we are doing, which is post-disaster and post-disaster. So yes, the only thing that is different now with the post-disaster is that people must take responsibility. So when we say people must wear masks, they must wear masks. And if they don't take responsibility, then it means we might end up in a disaster again, because the numbers will go up. And it's not just the individual that must take responsibility. We must take responsibility individually, severally, and collectively. So that if I'm not wearing a mask where I'm supposed to wear it, the next person must say, and the organizer must say, you must wear a mask. So I'm just using that as an example. So we don't have to have police present in every meeting, but collectively we should police our actions. In a way, we must act like, if you look at the, maybe I shouldn't use that example. I was going to use the example of tobacco. There are no police who arrest people who are smoking where they shouldn't, because the public polices it. Right from the beginning, it was the public that policed it. If you were smoking in a non-smoking, they will tell you so. So we hope that this can also become like that, where you are supposed to wash your hands, you wash your hands. And if you don't, people remind you, please wash your hands, and so on. So that it becomes second nature, but we take responsibility so that we don't have to be managed through the Disaster Management Act and policed and arrested, but we take responsibility and do the right things. I hope I'm answering your question.
Thank you, Minister. In other words, the entire act takes care of during the disaster and post-disaster. It's got provisions for that purpose. Dr. Patla, I think the Minister explained it very well. Thank you, Minister Nkosazana, but you stay on. There are still more questions coming. Oh, see. Okay. Let's do that. Let me be technologically savvy. Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, no, I was rural in technology. No. Now I'm clever. Dr. Patla?
I think we can mute now, Minister, because...
Yes, there is it.
Yeah, it's... Okay. Let me start with Linda Mnisi, on the question of whether we are moving at the right pace. You see, if there is one thing which COVID has taught us, is that even your most educated medical experts, many of them will tell you, even when they speak public, many of them will tell you, this is what we're projecting, but we can't tell you it's certain. And just in one meeting, I won't mention where with the colleagues, they were questioning about one of the experts whose name will remain anonymous, who has been one of those advising us over a period, but who recently was also saying on some of the things which we have been doing that it doesn't think it's necessary to continue doing. And some colleagues were saying, but this is the same person who few months ago said we must do A, B, C, D. But they say it's the same corona, just changing variants. But the same person is today saying, don't do, no more, it's not necessary to do this and that. Now, what I'm raising this, Linda, and other viewers and listeners, is that we follow what we know at the time. And this is what we know at the current time, is that we are stable, the infection rates are manageable, our health facilities are managing. What will happen, many scientists tell us we must not ignore what we see in other countries. And in terms of the pattern of the last 2 years, you have a 3 months kind of lull, and then after that you get a rise again of a variant. And that's why they say towards the end of April, beginning of May, likelihood that we'll have a variant, or it might even come earlier. The Omicron came much earlier than what we had anticipated. We had anticipated end of December, middle of December towards the end, or even January. Omicron came early in November. We had to quickly rise up to see that things are changing when we saw some clusters here in Tshwane, and then it started spreading and so on. So all that we're saying is we follow what we know now, the patterns. What is going to be like when there is a variant? We hear now that there is a certain B something dominant in Asia and the UK. There's some other mixture of various mutations which are causing problems. So we're monitoring that. We're receiving briefings. Even yesterday, I got a briefing from our team, national team, which is doing the surveillance and genomic studies, sequencing, the genomic sequences. So they've already given us some indication that they are watching something. How it's going to behave, we don't know. And they're picking up information because they share the information with the scientists in other parts. So at the present moment, we're doing the best of what we know, what we are anticipating, how severe, how moderate it's going to be when it does come, when exactly it will come. We just have projections. But we believe that with the lessons we have learned, we are not dismantling any of our capacity. The sequencing scientists are there, NICD is there, our National Health Laboratory Services, our various advisory committees remain in place so that when something changes, we will be able to move speedily and advise as health will advise government. Tamara Khan, in terms of overreach of the regulations, as I've said, the Act, the National Health Act is that people can have a look at it. We proposed those regulations, let me just explain again. Because they are amendments to surveillance and management of notifiable medical conditions, not just COVID, they also make us remain ready, even in terms of other notifiable medical conditions. That's why sometimes I see people confuse. Some of the things which are there, which we have not changed, which have been in the Act, and we're just republishing, are there to maintain, to manage even other notifiable medical conditions. But because of the fact that currently the main focus is COVID, as we get submissions, we will look at maybe fine-tuning to make sure that there's a little bit more focus on the COVID. So the issue of overreach, I want to dismiss that we have no desire to have draconian powers. They say that we want to manage people, we're going to arrest people and force them to drink medicine and so on. It's nothing like that. All that it says overall is that when there is a threat of a notifiable medical condition, there will be times when, as an individual in the protection of the public, you can't say that when you are suspected of having, and it's not necessarily COVID, it might be Ebola, it might be something else, that when you've got all the signs, you'll be persuaded by the medical people and so on. But if it reaches a stage where, there's a real dangerous notifiable medical condition and you insist that you don't want to be tested, for instance, then there will be certain, you can approach the courts and the courts can be able to issue an order that this person must be tested. So those are the things. The vaccines from Tamara Khan, and she says, why didn't we start preparing to exit once we got vaccines? Our focus has been to make sure that people are safe in terms of the public health measures, educating people, sharing information, making sure vaccines are available. And the Disaster Act, to us, as I said, was just a tool, very useful tool. So we're not obsessed with the fact that we are using this particular act. But as soon as it became clear that we are now stable, that's why we started actively looking at other alternatives. But our main focus all this time, including using this act, was not going to be really stuck on with regulation and so on. The main thing we have been focused on is saving lives and making sure that people know what to do. The vaccine stocks, at this stage, we are still discussing with various international partners to see whether we can do the swapping. And as we mentioned before, up to now, we have not yet succeeded in arriving at any particular agreement, but that's something which we are pursuing, because we would rather, have that, or even look at donations if necessary, if the utilization does not pick up more. But at this stage, unfortunately, we have not clinched any agreement with any country or anybody. Yeah, that's the Pfizer matter in terms of that we still have the stock, we still have additional stock. I don't have the actual numbers with me, but there's no doubt that because we prepared to vaccinate at least in terms of number of individuals, upwards of 30 million. And we are currently still sitting at 19. So I'm not talking about doses. Doses, we are now past 33 million. So in terms of doses, we have sufficient stock up to, we made provision for close to 60 million doses, so that we can, even with the double of Pfizer and even boosters and all that. So we definitely still have excess stock, and we're still discussing with various possible partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patla. I stopped you somewhere. Proceed.
The next question is from Sipokasi Vuso from Cape Times newspaper. What happens if the current regulations are not followed? For example, wearing a mask indoors, what are the consequences? The next question, Jody Jacobs from ENCA. This one is to the Minister of Health. With regards to temperature screening registers in the workplace, does this fall away? The next two questions are from Anastasi Mokobu from Jacaranda FM News. Given that many South Africans won't have access to digital platforms to access the government gazette, how will ordinary South Africans be assisted to comment on the regulations? The second question, could the ministers elaborate on the process that will be followed in considering public input? Will this, for example, be taken to parliamentary structures for input as well? The next question is from Ritumeti Makwea from the Citizen. Since masks are here to stay according to the proposed draft health regulations, and the President also declaring it's time for individuals to take responsibility, how is the government planning to increase vaccinations? Is it time for vaccine mandate? The next two questions are from Natasha Piri from SABC News. To Minister Patla and Minister Dlamini Zuma, is it wise to lift the national state of disaster with a looming fifth wave? The second question from Natasha, in terms of international arrivals, will the proof of vaccination rule and the provision of a negative PCR test at the border fall away after 30 days? Or do they stay? The next two questions are three questions, Minister, are from Christian Duplessis from Netwerk 24. In countries like the Netherlands and France, masks are only worn on public transport, although they have higher numbers of infections as compared to South Africa. Why do we still have to wear masks indoors, although our rate of infections is much lower? How long will these health regulations have to be in place? Is the slow rate of vaccination holding us back from a complete return to normality? How does government intend to deal with these issues? That's all the questions, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They are more than I thought. It means you guys are engaging. Thank you very much. What do you do if regulations are not being followed? Yes, I'm unmuted. I'm clever. I'm cleverer now. What do you do if regulations are not followed? What are you going to do with the tradition of temperature taking at work? How are you going to spread the information regarding regulations for broader participation? Will Parliament play a role? There's a lot of story about masks, vaccination, the mandatory vaccination. If we do what we are doing, how wise it is if there's a possibility of fifth wave. The border, PCR test, and so on, are those going to stay? In France, masks are only worn in public transport, during public transport. From the caller, seemingly they are at a lower scale than us. Why are we keeping them? And how long are we going to? That's it. Can we start with Dr. Patla and then we'll follow? Okay.
Maybe you
Thank you. Let's start with you, Minister Nkosazana. Thank you. You can hear me now. You can hear me now.
I can hear you.
Okay.
But I also have an engagement in about 20 minutes, so that's why I'm starting, so that you could allow me to
Okay.
leave.
Let's hope by then we'll be done. Just take all
I
your
hope
questions
so.
now, Mam Nkosazana.
I hope so. I just want to take the question of whether it's wise to terminate the national state of disaster when there is a fifth wave looming. The Disaster Management Act only kicks in when there is a disaster. It doesn't kick in anticipation of a disaster, so that we now say we're in a state of disaster when we are not. The definition is very clear. But as I said, if the fifth wave is such that the country becomes, the pandemic becomes a disaster, then the Disaster Management Act will come back and the National State of Disaster will come back. But we can't keep it because somebody says there must be a fifth wave. When the fifth wave comes, we'll also see whether the fifth wave is such that it becomes a disaster. If not, then we won't bring it back. The normal regulations from health and other departments will manage the situation. And then what if regulations are not they are not respected? You know, Utata once said, which things are in our hands. This time, because the disaster is past, but the pandemic is still there, it's in our hands. Because we can manage with our own resources. We can wash hands. We can put on masks where we're supposed to put on masks. We can have gatherings according to the rules where we're supposed to. And that's why I was saying we need to respect these individually and collectively. It really is in our hands. But all we can say is if the situation escalates to a point of being a disaster, the Disaster Management Act will come back, classification will come back as a disaster, and then the declaration of the National State of Disaster will happen again. So it's really in our hands, but we will be watching and health will be advising us, and it will be obvious when it's a disaster because the numbers will be high, the hospitals will get threatened, will be threatening to be full, the ICUs. So it will be clear when it's a disaster, people will be dying, and we won't even wait for people to die in big numbers. But obviously, when the hospitals start filling up, ICU and so on, to be clear if the health regulations and other regulations from other sectors are not coping, and then it will come back. But I think the message is that let's all be responsible. Let's all protect ourselves and others. Nobody is safe until we are all safe. So let's all respect the regulations individually and collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Gungubele. I'll take the questions. I think Minister Dlamini Zuma has dealt with some of them. The question of temperatures at workplace, we have now reduced the requirements in terms of regulated as those which have been outlined. So anything which is not in those regulations means that it's not required in terms of regulation. But as we said earlier, over this period, we have also learned just to look after ourselves. The issue of temperature, so it's no more a requirement, but in gatherings and in workplaces, wherever, it's still something which one would not say people who are hosting gatherings and also in workplaces need to necessarily just throw away, because a rise in temperature, a high temperature in individual is still a sign that something is not right. It might just be a flu, it might be something else. There are many infectious diseases which show with a high temperature. So the one snag which many of our advisors have been raising is that the instruments we are using most of the time are not reliable. I'm sure many of you will have come across where you enter a shop, they put this thing and it tells you 33 degrees. Now you are not alive at 33 degrees. Or sometimes it says 45 degrees. Either way, at 45 degrees, you must be in ICU or somewhere, whatever. I mean, it's not normal. It's abnormal body temperature. So all that we would say is that if you have the right instrument, of course, also because they take surface temperature, which is also affected by weather, so it can be quite... But all that I'm saying, for instance, the issue of all of you would know that, for instance, everybody who arrives, especially at airports, I'm not sure whether land posts, we also do that, but at the airports, in terms of international arrivals, there's a very reliable temperature scanner there, which we all have to go through. But that one is checked regularly and is properly managed. So the temperature which it shows there, it's really your real body temperature. So it is useful. So in gatherings, workplaces, if whoever is in charge can make sure that the instrument is calibrated properly and is able to get the right temperature, it's not. I mean, some people feel it's intrusive, but it's a useful thing which will pick up even other conditions which you may not be aware of and which can affect, especially in a gathering. So it's not necessarily that you will be doing it because it's a requirement. The access to the health regulations, this has been brought to our attention that thus far the only access which in terms of people making submissions, it's more through your digital platforms. So it's a matter which I've asked that our DG and the team should look at to make it accessible also in terms of people who want to write, maybe fax or a phone call might be a difficult one because to capture exactly what somebody is saying, it's better if it's in a format where it can be written. So we will look at, before the end date of 15 April, to expand to see what other platforms. I'm sure colleagues here at GCIS can also advise, usually when there are these public comments, beyond digital platforms, how do we make sure that those who want to maybe, email, fax, and so on, I think it's something which has been put to our attention, which I've asked that our team should look at while we still have about 10 days or so before the end. Whether these inputs will be taken to Parliament, the answer is no. This will be managed by the department in the same way as now with these regulations, post-recovery regulations. They were under Minister Dlamini Zuma's Department of COGTA. They were processed. They brought in capacity to process all the... we also, from our side, we are looking at extending our capacity because I'm told already we have thousands of comments. So, but the team is already working. So we're just including expanding our own capacity because only the Act goes to Parliament. Once the Act is passed and the Act enables the Minister and the Department to publish regulations, to gazette regulations, that's where it is currently. So I know as I said earlier on, I've seen on the media some colleagues in Parliament are saying, why doesn't this have to come back to Parliament? But these are the laws which have been passed. If they want to amend the laws, then they must initiate that process of amendment to our Acts. Otherwise, the acts most of the acts which departments are working under do make provisions for regulations, and because regulations are just to manage things from day to day. There's been an informed approach not to want to bring regulations back to Parliament. Otherwise, it will be difficult to manage a lot of things. The fifth wave, I think, Minister Dlamini Zuma has dealt with that. As I said earlier, we're not dismantling our capacity to monitor on a daily basis. We're still monitoring. We know how many people are in hospital, how many are seriously ill, and so on. NICD reports if there's a different behavior. The people with the genomic sequencing, they take samples from different parts of the country. If they see something changes, they inform us. As I said, even yesterday, I got the report in terms of some changes which they've recognized, but they're still studying to see how far it's going to go. Ports of entry, what happens in 30 days? After 30 days, what we expect is that from the health side, because these provisions are also there in our in the health regulations, this would now have been concluded, have been assessed with the inputs, and then they will be able to kick in to make sure that we still have some control at the work at the borders. The question of masks, I don't know whether it was France or Netherlands, somewhere in Europe, where they've got higher infections, only masks in the transport, public transport. I think the key issue is indoor. Public transport, it's taken as, even in our case, when we say indoor, we also include public transportation. But countries, based on the same advice from scientists and WHO, use different variations. I mean, it's a subject to interpretation. They may have had their decision to exclude fixed indoor facilities, but we include fixed indoor facilities over and above public transport. So that's really the choice of the public health authorities of that particular country. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We were told that was the last question, and we think we have had, to this extent, quite significant period of interaction. We'll continue interacting as we spread the information across, and must thank the Media House for responding to this promptly, and I must thank the two ministers for the meticulous way they've tried to respond to questions. At that point, because of other logistics, we would request that we end here, and thank you all. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.